Welcome to a new podcast episode. This time I'm talking to Paul Behrens. Um, how would you pronounce it? Because you're English.
Oh, Behrens, but
Behrens. Behrens.
Behrens is the original.
Yeah, it's not. See, I when we got your book, it sounded so. Your name sounds so Dutch, so I assumed. And you you're teaching now as a professor on the University of Leiden. So I assumed you were Dutch, but then I found out you lived in UK, you were born in UK, and then you moved out to New Zealand for a long time, and now you're actually in the Netherlands. So, um, so I want to talk to you a little bit about how you got there, but I just want to make sure that people understand who you are. You've written the book, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Science. We've talked about this book in our book podcast, which comes out later. But I thought it would be a good idea to talk to you and to learn more about why you did this and so on. So I forgot to say welcome. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Erno.
Stupid. Anyway, so you just mentioned in our short pre-conversation that you had like a kind of feelings about the COP27, which is going on at the moment. Why is the COP27 important? Because it's already COP27, right? It didn't stick with one. We just agreed about these things and we just go. No, it's just 27th version, and it feels like not much is changing after these COPs. How do you feel about this, and how do you feel about the 27th?
Yeah, it's a strange mix of feeling that these are international gatherings where we can really make actual headway against climate change, against mitigation, adaptation, and most importantly, coming together as a world. So things surrounding loss and damage, things surrounding funding from high-income nations, which haven't felt as much of the brunt of climate change as low-income nations. So the sort of international financing for adaptation and mitigation. And it feels like it's really important. I was at COP26. I didn't go to this COP because there was actually no way of getting there without flying. And I got to the stage where I just couldn't do it anymore. I just felt really, really awful. And so I was making these sort of cost benefit calculations in my head. If I go to this place, maybe I can make an impact on this thing. And yes, I can do the direct offsetting of the flights and the emissions and da 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 da. And eventually it just got to the stage about 5 years ago, and I just thought, no, I can't do that anymore. It just doesn't feel right. It's not no judgment against anybody else, and luckily I have family close by, but I just internalized it, climate change, through the book so much I couldn't do it anymore. So I didn't go to this one, but the previous COP, the sense that I got was, yes, it's important for international discussions, and yes, it's important for networking and people bringing people together. But often it's behind where any sort of single one country or even one public is, if you like. So there's sort of like a barometer for where society is, but sort of maybe a few years ago, if that makes any sense. So the last COP26 was the first time that fossil fuels, the coal was mentioned in the text. And you would think, well, it took 26 COPs to mention the single biggest contribution to climate change. that's a long time, but it was momentous at the same time. So even though it was like years behind where it should be, it was kind of momentous that this was agreed upon by all states around the world in the summary text. So I see the COPs as a mix of this sort of whirling of greenwashing, this whirling of saying the right things, but seeing not enough action. And also this reflection of the direction of things. That is an improvement over previous COPs. There have been massive improvements in renewable energies, in the solutions, in the behavioral and societal changes that we need. We understand pretty much all of that now. So how fast can we go towards that goal is then the real question. And so the COPs are like a little barometer, and they might be slightly behind where everybody, where people are really in reality, but it's where the international community is. And so that's very interesting.
The agreements in Paris a couple of years ago they were really celebrated as making a big difference. Um, and yet, this year the IPCC came with a new report that it was just much worse than we expected. It was going faster than we expected. When I read recent books about climate change and papers, they pretty much agree it's going to be like very difficult, probably even impossible to stick below the 1.5 degrees increase in temperature, which is like probably it triggers a lot of things we don't know yet. And of course, after 1.5, there's 1.6. It's not just jumping to 2 degrees, but still, it's going much faster than we want. We're looking at droughts. We're looking at people in Italy and Spain probably don't have enough drinking water in 2030, even earlier. But we've seen this year the heat waves and the droughts and also floods everywhere in Europe. So, of course, it's worse at the southern hemisphere, but it's getting closer now, and we feel it. We actually feel the impact of what we've, done for the last century or so.
Yeah, unleashed. Yeah, there's a few things there that's really important to notice. Is that the scientists and the IPCC has done a great job of the overall temperatures. So the understanding of the amount of warming we would get for certain amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and some of the cycles of these gases has gone really well. On the whole, it's been really quite accurate. What the problem has been is that the estimations on what that means for the big energy systems around the planet and how they change in response. So that has been underestimated, how fast that could change. So some of these impacts that we're seeing in terms of extreme weather events, in terms of impacts on food systems, a lot of these things are emerging earlier than we thought from climate change. So the average temperature, we're pretty good estimates on that. All these other things, oh my God, we've undercooked it. We haven't realized how much this could really affect those extreme weather events. Now, that was in Working Group 1 of the assessment report 6 that came out recently. In Working Group 2, then, that looks at the vulnerabilities of that, we have also overestimated our ability to adapt. I mean, of course, those two things are sort of related, aren't they? I mean, if things go faster on the ground, it's going to be harder for us to adapt. But also, there are many statements in the totality of the research, which the IPCC brings together, that shows that we have overestimated, our capacity for creativity and adaptation too. So it's extremely worrying. This, on the other side, is some areas have gone faster than we thought in terms of being able to reduce emissions, in terms of the technologies, in terms of solar and wind, in terms of the behavioral changes that we know we need, in terms of plant-based diets, in terms of a demand-side response of energy, so reducing the amount of energy that we need. All of those have gone much faster than we thought. So it's this race against two things that we've underestimated. How bad things could get, and also how sort of creative we are in some of the technologies and some of the solutions that we have and some of the behavioral changes. But the problem is that because these things are coming at us so fast, the difficulty is then being able to plan and being able to respond, rather than just putting out fires, quite literally in many cases. Actually having the leadership to actually do the things that we know we need to do, which would be better for that adaptation, better for the geopolitical issues that we're seeing around Ukraine, better for our air quality, our water quality, our health, regardless of even the climate issues. So it's this constant race, which is why it's so nail-biting right now. And I say this as somebody in the high-income nations who's relatively cushioned from some of the impacts of climate change. So nail biting is perhaps not right. I mean, horrifying in a sense, what's happening around the world. Sort of what happened in Pakistan recently during the flooding there. So you're quite right to highlight this dynamic that these things are coming harder and faster than we thought, and our ability to adapt to them is going to be tested to the absolute limit.
You are a scientist, and scientists always have to be very sure about the things, have to have research behind it, which is, checked and double checked before they say something which is important for the future. And also, as a scientist, you are at the forefront of all this information, of this knowledge. And the knowledge that you have is written down in this book, but also is not, I wouldn't say available. That's not the right word, because it is available, but is not absorbed by like probably 90% of the people. If I say 20, 80, I think that's pessimistic. So what I can imagine that it is pretty difficult, is I'm looking for a better word, but difficult, let's say difficult for you as a scientist to look at the world where you know what direction we are going, as like a small group of people who look to the world from that lens. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, you hit what's really been bothering me a lot recently, and though is this frustration around it. We know that the renewables that we've already put into the system and the efforts that we've made in the energy transition has already saved tens of billions of euros in Europe. But imagine if we'd gone faster and we'd done the things that we knew we needed to do anyway, then we could have avoided the social destabilization of inflation, which is largely driven by energy inflation and the cost of energy. I mean, and so that trickles down into all the energy using activities and sectors of the economy. And if you look in the scientific literature, there are plans. There are plans. Policymakers could have followed these plans, pathways. Even if it was the International Energy Agency, which have lots of wonderful researchers, plans that could get you to 1.5 degrees. It would take more involvement from government. We'd have to be careful about the politics around that, maybe using citizens' assemblies, these sorts of things. But it's so obvious. It's so clear. And what the real case of the matter is who wins and loses in this situation. So who loses out in this situation and who wins in this situation? How do we make sure that people are taken care of during this transition, especially the most vulnerable? And one thing that you see when you talk to politics and you talk in political circles is this level of attention. It's an attention economy, isn't it? It's whatever we're paying attention to, which is whatever we're focused on. And you see that time again in the political sphere as a scientist. And this is my sort of anecdotal experience, but of course, there's lots of research looking at this as well. I don't research in that area. I just read some of the research coming out. But politicians and decision makers are confronted with this attention space, and their attention is grabbed. It's grabbed by the lobbying, by certain companies, certain interest groups, because they're going to lose out in this transition. And so what that means is the politicians are then focused on solutions which are very much about what the incumbent powers want, the incumbent companies, corporations want. So I was talking in Parliament in the UK recently, and we were talking about the necessity to improve the net zero strategy, which in the UK has been deemed, it's been ruled illegal. It's been ruled unlawful by the High Court for not being good enough. And you read through it, and of course it's not good enough. And you see the politicians sort of reacting to this. And one politician said, all I'm hearing about is biomass, hydrogen, and carbon capture and sequestration. Can you say something to these? And I said, yeah, I gave them a little quick rundown. Biomass, by and large, pretty horrendous. Uses huge areas of land, because we can only convert about 1 to 2% of the sun into plants and then use that in biofuels. It's a really bad way to do it compared to pretty much every other way. Hydrogen, there is a role for it, but it is much smaller than what people think and what you're hearing about all the time. And the reason you're hearing about this all the time is because the incumbent industries think they have a path there, which they can push that above other solutions, because maybe the solar and wind industry isn't so powerful in the political lobbying. And carbon capture and sequestration, which, yeah, I mean, this carbon capture and sequestration of power plants is a non-starter. If we're then talking about, that's where you put capture on the power plants themselves and keep the fossil fuel power stations running. Incredibly expensive. Renewables are already cheaper than fossil fuel power plants. It would be crazy to go down that road. But if you're talking about direct air capture and then drawing carbon out in the second half of the century, then you're still missing the biggest solutions that we have. And nobody's talking about it. I didn't quite go so far with this politician to say the reason why you're hearing this is the people who are in the room with you. But it certainly felt that me and another scientist there, it certainly felt that was quite rare. You know, we had a room of sort of 15, 20 MPs, which was a great turnout. I mean, they were flowing out the door. And so the interest is there. It's just getting the access. You know, it's getting the access for those things. So we can say, yes, there's going to be winners and losers on this. But we know from the science, even from the physics of this, really, that it's going to be mostly wind and solar. There'll be hydro, there'll be existing nuclear, continue running those. There will be lots of transmission and things. But that's what it's going to have to look like, because there's actually very few other ways to make our cells fit on the planet. And the question up to you politicians is, how do you deal with the winners and losers? But that's not what they hear. They hear the potential losers in this transition, and then they see the modeling that they do, which is, you know, bananas. You know, Shell talking about drawing down continent-sized areas of carbon using forestry and things, you know, like things that are non-starters due to the land issues, due to the food system, for example. So, yeah, maybe this is a lot of frustration coming out now.
Which I think is fair, because I have similar frustrations. And for example, you just mentioned Shell. They agreed that we cannot continue in that direction. We have to do something about stopping fossil fuels. But until the time, we just increase the number of oil that we drill up with 35%. What? You want to catch up and you want to go fast into the direction of the big hole, the big, I don't know what's, you know, in hell, whatever. I don't know how you say this, but also, like you mentioned, I think the whole situation with trust, and if you listen to this, it today is November 7, 2022, you just had a Prime Minister, Lady Truss, despite her name, which I think sounds a lot like trust.
Yeah.
You know, was influenced by a lot of these lobbies, and I only look from a distance because, like I said, I don't follow news that much as you do, specifically not governmental news. But you know, if you're in the room with all these companies and organizations that just make a lot of money right now and just care about shareholders, I think you're in the wrong room.
That's why I think that, yes, you are. Yes, very much the wrong room. A scary room. I think that's also where this democracy side of things comes into the picture. So how do you get that representation in the room? And what does that representation even look like? I'm going to give an example for some recent research, and then I'll talk about citizens' assemblies.
Right.
Recent research suggests that we have underestimated how much people want to change. We're too cynical about our neighbors, way too cynical. So there was a paper out recently that looked at a representative sample from all different backgrounds and walks of life in the US, about 6,000 people. And they did a really clever experiment. They said to these 6,000 people, what percentage of people do you think support a carbon tax? And they said 37% of people. And then they asked them all, do you support a carbon tax? 67% of people, or around that, it's 65, 67% of people. So they were way too cynical. And that was true across the board. It was like, how supportive are you of renewables? How supportive of you are of the Green New Deal, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, the carbon tax was one of the lowest ones. You know, I gave the most negative picture there. So we cynically underestimate our neighbors. And we see evidence of this also around the world when we look at citizens' assemblies. So where we have a few hundred people selected at random from all walks of life across the country. So in the UK Climate Citizens Assembly, they talked to 108 people from all different backgrounds and walks of life. They got the scientists in the room. They got the people in the room to say, this is where we're at. These are the choices that we have, and these choices that we have, these are the things that they each do. Now, what would you like to do? And these are people from all, as I say, all walks of life. These are not people who have solar panels on their roofs, or these are people who are struggling to get through their days, as we all do, but some more than others. And they came up with policies far beyond where the politicians were at. So they said, let's talk about banning SUVs, frequent flyer levies, cuts in meat. When have you ever heard a politician talk about these sorts of things, other than just on the very margins? But this is what you ask the people, and this is what the people want. You can say, okay, Paul, that's great, really exciting, but what do people do privately? There's this attitude behavior gap. But the point is that we as a society want more. We do want more from this as a collective, So I think one of the ways in which we get past these sort of these obstacles is to have more of these sorts of deliberative democracy processes, which get those voices in the room, which get the scientists in the room to talk about, well, this paper, they studied this, and we can have an energy system that looks like this, and it would cost this much. What would you like to do? We've got this one as well that maybe does this thing. How would you like to choose these different futures? This is what they mean for people. You may not realize it, but 1,000 people die in the EU every day from air pollution early. So, and this is something in the book, this is hundreds of thousands of people every year die early of air pollution, especially in the Netherlands with terrible, terrible air pollution where I live, for example. Do you want, this is how much it costs the NHS. If you want to be about that and you don't want to be about, you want to look at the costs, then that's how much it costs. And this is how much it would cost to change. I've got my imaginary whiteboard behind me here. But so I think these are quite exciting, opportunities and ideas, and we should start to embrace them more and get used to them, get the word out that these are good ways to do things. The Irish have been doing this for some time. They had an abortion citizens' assembly, for example, and you can make them legally binding, which wasn't the case for the UK Citizen Assembly. And of course, when it comes down to it, politics comes into everything. How do you build the citizen assembly is important in terms of the results that you get. Are they going to be legally binding, and things like this? But these are the sorts of tools that we definitely need to be using to address this issue that we've both been talking about.
I agree so much with you. We read the book Nu is dan ons van Eva Rovers. She is all about the citizen assembly in the Netherlands. She has this it's a small book. Great examples. The one in Ireland is there, but also some failures, like in France. Like it wasn't legally binding. It was, the initiative came from the president, but then the government wasn't in on it. So I think they added 3 of the suggestions to the new ideas that the government, agreed upon. So I think the Netherlands has a huge opportunity to do something here, to look at these citizens' assemblies and use them to look at these huge tasks that we are at, the huge transformations that we are at, and talk about one topic at a time. And like in a small part of Belgium, they have, like the German speaking part of Belgium, they have these citizens' assemblies as a ongoing process. I think there are great examples out there that we can work this, and as an individual, as a citizen, I am not involved with these large companies, organizations that that are paying huge sums of money and have all these lawyers and working for them to get politicians to do some things. I'm just an individual. I'm concerned about me and my children. That's it. Not about how Shell is doing or how the stockholders of Shell are doing. I'm concerned about my future and my next generation. So and I can even accept some personal loss to a better future for my children. And I think that's a huge difference between politicians, because they not only, but they're mostly concerned about the next 4 years, which is the governmental term that they're worried about. Will I be elected the next time again? And that's not a good time period to look for as a future.
Yeah, exactly. When some of these things are unfolding over decades, centuries, millennia. I mean, if you look at biodiversity crisis, it takes millions of years to recover from biodiversity crises. So it's just such a huge sort of sci-fi sort of unique moment in human civilization to be here right now, to be in this period of huge upheaval. Whatever happens now, we've got some extremely concerning, awful decades ahead of us. To be quite frank, I mean, full of lots of suffering, lots of issues, lots of geopolitical tensions, all sorts of different things, and it's easy to see how things could go badly here. But in terms of opportunities, things like citizens' assemblies do seem to be one of the ways in which you could see things improve. And as you say, it's not always going to come out in the direction that we need, but it's going to be involving people, and it's going to be far beyond where the politicians are at. Just on that point, in terms of individuals, we can actually address 70% of our issues with only a handful of technologies and changes and behavior changes. And really, I get very fed up of hearing about sort of buzzy sort of gimmicks and apps and gadgets and things like this, because it's really so simple. It's wind, it's solar, it's transmission, it's insulating houses, it's plant-based diets, and it's changes in transportation. And if you were to do those things, imagine if you had a problem in your life and you could fix sort of 70, even 80% of that problem. That would be you with just five actions. You would do it in a self-help book, although maybe we all have trouble with that. But it's ridiculously, it's just those set of things. And that's why it comes down to what I mentioned before about the winners and losers. It's so clear that those are the ways forwards, that they're more efficient, that they're cheaper, that they're better for the economy, that they're better for our health, our environment all around us. I mean, to take just plant-based diets, for example, if we were to go plant-based in high-income nations only, we had research out earlier this year that showed that we would save an area the size of the EU worldwide. In the UK, for example, if the UK only went to plant-based, you would save an area the size of almost Scotland. And imagine what that does for our mental health.
What do you mean by save area? How do you save area by just eating plants?
Yeah, good point. I skipped over a step. We use about 80%. We use about half of all habitable land for agriculture, and about 80% of that is for animal agriculture. But we get most of our calories from plants, and animals actually convert only between 3 and 17%, so 3% to 17% of calories into edible calories for us. They use up a huge amount of land, that 80% again. Now, if you were to eat plants directly, you would cut out all the efficiency losses. You would cut out all of the nitrogen onto the fields. You would cut out all of the air pollution, the water pollution that you get from animals, the antimicrobial resistance that's building, the pandemics that are building because of the way we rear animals today. In most cases, you'd be much healthier too. I mean, the Lancet Eat Planetary Diet was basically on health, and then they looked at the planetary impacts, and that would be much better too. And because we feed about a third of all crops to animals too, we could just eat those crops directly. And what that means is that we save a huge amount of land. And because we save that land, it means that we can revert that land back to natural vegetation. And natural vegetation, natural environments, natural ecosystems, even natural ruminants. You could have natural ruminants on, bison. You could have natural ruminants on the land, but actually grazing as they would have done in a healthy way. And that land would hold a lot more carbon than the pastures do today, for example. And so you can take those croplands and take most of that out of rotation too. And so what that means is you can draw down carbon from the atmosphere. And we found in our study earlier this year, for example, that you can double your impacts by moving towards a plant-based diets if we leave that land free for rewilding. And so you can actually double the impacts. You can draw down some of this carbon that we know is a real issue to bring down. We can bring that down via this. Now, the farmers obviously need to be taken care of in this transition, and people need options and choices. Nobody likes to be told what to do. But we do know that the more we engage in these behaviors, the easier they become and the faster we get the shifts. One final thing about that vision is, often I'm thinking about what's that vision in the future if we do make these transitions? And that vision is so, so nice. Looking out your window, you've got nature all around you. You've got a world that is maybe harsher, more difficult to react to in terms of the adaptations to climate change. But everything that we've done has taken the edge off things. So having the rewilding means that the storm surges, the energy is taken out of the storm surges. It holds more flood water. These sorts of things, you feel healthier because we don't have air pollution in the skies anymore. We're not eating things that are bad for our health. These sorts of things. And yes, the world is a harsher, environment. You've got harsher weather, but actually, for many people whose lives are a struggle today, that could be better in the future. So it's these sorts of, the reason why I bring this up is because we have to have this imagination about how our world looks and having like parks near us. I mean, in the Netherlands, for example, if I think about going away for the weekend to nature, quote unquote, I've got a selection of places, but it's fairly limited. Imagine if we had the shift, you would have, instead of 5 parks that you normally go to or 4 parks, you'd have 15, 20. And we know that the mental health of people really improves when they're in nature. Like that is just so obvious from all of the meta-analyses in a significant way. Anxiety comes down, stress comes down, depression comes down, all these sorts of different things. And so this is the vision. We have to connect the science, the science that says depressive tendencies, with you have loads of parks near you can go explore. There's this one that has this, ecosystem, and this one that has this, and you go mountain biking in that one, these sorts of things. Been talking for a while there, but it's this vision,
Yeah. There's one thing that listening to you, what you just mentioned, that came to my mind is, as a scientist, you see this bad world exploding, maybe, all this stuff that's going on, like you just mentioned, and it feels very negative. It feels very a bad story that we don't want to hear. And the better the story becomes, the more we want to close ourselves off of these stories, because we feel that if it becomes really bad, we cannot change it. We have no influence, so why should I change anything? I think I just go on a holiday with a plane now because I don't know what's coming tomorrow, instead of, okay, I think we should just ban all flying. And then they say, no, that's not fair. People with low income should be able to fly. Yeah, of course, if you're a flying company or if you're a Schiphol, then that is true. But if you are looking for a better world, that is not really how we should look at it. The thing that you did in your book, which I think is interesting, is that you've written every time from a pessimistic view to the situation and a hopeful view to the situation. I think personally that it is necessary to hear the bad story, to hear this bad news. Otherwise, we don't feel the urgency to change. I've just been recently talking to Ronald Rovers. He's a scientist also in the Netherlands, and he calculates things through, right? If somebody has a suggestion, we should, capture carbon, he's going to calculate it through. If everybody should move to electric vehicles, he's going to calculate that this is pretty impossible. If we're looking at 8 billion people in the world, that's not going to happen because of the resources that are not there. We don't have that amount of resources, right? So there's so much going on if you're looking at the bad story. But the good thing of your book is that it also looks about the hope of the same situation. For example, the farmers you just mentioned, right? So right now there's a lot of discussion going in the Netherlands going on about the farmers. We don't see a future for our children on our farm. We are stuck in a situation because the banks are doing this to us, or we have this food system, right? All these companies are just supplying the farmers with foods that are coming from all over the world and not from the Netherlands, which is bad for climate anyway. So there's so much things. If you look at the farmer from a independent view, a fair view, you would say we have to change it. But if you in the middle of it as a farmer, I can understand it is very difficult to attach yourself from your current situation the way you make your income, the way you think about the future for your children, the feeling that you have with the cows or the pigs or the birds that you have right now on your farm, everything that's going on, right? The land that you have accumulated over the years, you feel like it's unfair that we are, as a whole, as a community, as a world, as a citizen, attacking them for causing all these difficulties that we're having now. What, and you just mentioned a little bit about, what do you think is a is a way that we can handle this better?
Yeah, I mean,
Big question. I'm sorry.
yeah, huge question. No, but it's a great question. It depends. It so depends on the local contexts. So if you look at other industries that have successfully transitioned in or are transitioning in different countries, sometimes it's just the buyouts, and that's what's happening in the Netherlands. And sometimes the buyouts are enough. So if you look at the transition of coal in Germany or Spain, for example, or the transition of coal in South Africa, for example, the people are just buying out the industries. And the question then really sort of becomes, well, if renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels, why are we having to buy them out? Why are we having to do that? Why can't we just shift these things? It's the political influence. So a lot of fossil fuel generators in different countries, say in China, in India, in South Africa, they have rights to run, and they are allowed to run politically. So they have these rights that they can actually go, keep running no matter what the sort of economic situation. So basically, they need buying out, and so that's one option. Now in the Netherlands, as I understand it, that is the buying out. There is the buying out there. So then the concerns become more sort of cultural about what does the land look like, what's right for me and my family. Unfortunately, in the Netherlands, it has to be very location specific, because in the UK, there's what's called the National Food Strategy, which looked at how do we transition the food system that's in a healthy way for society and for farmers. And in the UK, farmers in the National Food Strategy, which wasn't adopted, by the way, so politically, and I can get onto the politics there, but they gave 3 different options, or even more different options for farmers for their land, and said, what would you like to do with your land? We need a certain number to do this. It's almost like voluntary redundancy. When you're leaving a job, who would like to move on, explore other things? And that's a very different proposition to saying you have to stop, or you have to stop specifically, or you there. And for that reason, the National Food Strategy in the UK was hugely supported by many of the sort of different areas of agriculture. And it was very supported by chefs, by health professionals, by environmental professionals. It wasn't adopted, apparently, because many of the ministers working at the main ministry that would be adopting it actually have large land holdings, and they were worried about the change themselves. So it was the richest of the rich that stopped it. It wasn't the farmers who actually really wanted those options. And then they could make those decisions on their own terms in their own area, in terms of what they would like and what the communities around them would like. Should we rewild our one here? Maybe should we switch to this kind of crops here, multi-cropping here? What should we do with this? Should we do some sort of land sharing with animals and livestock? Here, these sorts of things. But it's options. I think that's what people. And so I think in the Netherlands, and I'm not fully integrated in all of the discussions here, but the impression that I get from the outside as an English speaker is that it's difficult because there are very specific places that need to change. So how do you then ask those people and get those people on board as a community as well, and talk with them in the dialogue around it? And of course, things have broken down, and there's a lot of acrimony, and it's a you versus them sort of thing. Whereas, what we really needed is something more participatory, and something more of a new social contract around this. Because I think everybody agrees at this stage this stuff needs to change. So what kind of image do you have for this land? I'm sure these sorts of things have been tried, but I would say that not every problem that we're going to have during the transition is going to be as hard as that one, because of the lack of options, because of the specificity of the regions which have to change due to their nature zones.
I'm not quite sure, but you are a scientist and probably know more about it. But looking at the discussions that we have for these wind turbines on land, like everywhere where they propose it, there is a lot of discussion going on. There's a lot of people who are against it. If I look at my area, there's been signs all over by saying we don't want these wind turbines in our region. So we want, of course, all to change the way that we get our energy, electricity, but we don't want it in our own backyard, right? So that's I think that's a general thing that I see in the Netherlands. I'm not aware of the other countries, but I see that in the Netherlands. And about the farmers, and I talked to Johannes Recheling. He's a farmer, and he had there was an island, I'm not sure which one of the Wadden Island. They have 7 farmers with cows, and they produce milk. And the government proposed, so if we need to decrease it, we need to buy out 1. And the farmers, of course, all didn't want to be the one, right? There's 7 out there. None of them wanted to be the one who was going to buy it. They all wanted to keep farming. So they sat together and said, so how can we reduce as a whole to accomplish the same result? And they did. So I think, like you just said, having this idea of doing it together. And now he's also involving the citizens, because he's offering the cheese as a specific cheese coming from that island, and not just one farmer, but these farms together, and selling it to people by trying to get a new relationship between citizens and farmers, right? I think that's really important, right? So getting away from the whole us and them situation, right? Polarization is just not helpful in these kind of situations.
And farmers taking on that role of land, being on the land and cultivating that land, their role in then sort of talking to the communities around them about how that land might be used, I think is absolutely vital. You do see the same thing with wind turbines, for example, on shore. The issue that you get often, and this has been shown over and over again in the UK, which is also an area that's had problems with onshore. Offshore is going really well. Onshore is a real problem. And what you see over and over again is you get these helicopter groups come in. And so when there's a plan for wind turbines, you get these interest groups, these lobby groups come in and pepper the community with lots of misinformation, things about, wind turbines killing birds, which is, absolutely nuts. And on that, one wind turbine which produces enough for thousands of houses kills a bird roughly every once a year. One cat kills approximately 9 birds a year. It's hard to measure, but it's this is the sort of scales that we're talking about. Buildings kill orders of magnitude more birds. Cars do, and so it's very easy to believe if you're peppering in this information, and as you say, people are just wanting to get about their lives. Just to reflect on your point about the raw material requirement for the energy transition, because this comes up a lot as well, is we do need to change the demand for that energy, for sure. But ultimately, if you look at the amount of material that we move for the fossil fuel system today and compare it to the one-time movement of material we need for the energy transition, the fossil fuels today are far, far more than it will ever be during the energy transition. So we have to be very, very careful. We need to move as little as possible. Move to trains, move to bikes, move to all the sort of different things. But it is there, and it is going to be less movement of material. And most of those materials are usable afterwards. So we do this once, and then it's moving from what we say in science from a flows-based system where we're burning this fossil fuels and then it just dissipates into the atmosphere and causes all of our problems, or many of our problems, to a system where it's stocks-based. It's built in the infrastructure around us. We no longer have to bring in the fuels and then just to burn them and then dissipate them into the atmosphere. We actually have the stocks within our communities, within our society, and then we can reuse the stocks over and over and over again. And actually, there are very few areas in the energy transition where we don't think we can reuse those materials. There'll be some losses, maybe 5 to 10% of different materials with the really hard to reuse. But in general, it's looking fairly positive, you know, in terms of reusing these things. So just to put that out there, because one of the things that you see is like some of this information that's being pushed back. Oh, we don't have the materials for this. Oh, you know, it's going to be all China, or it's all going to be, it's used again to try and slow down this transition that we need. And that transition does have to be the demand. And of course, it is more complicated than that. It takes a long time for mines to come up and running. You know, any new mine will be a huge impact on communities, especially in other countries that might be lower income, that might not have the same power in the negotiations and things. These are all things that we should be concerned about. We have to keep these things in perspective.
No, I agree. I was just thinking not as a break on implementing, you know, solar and wind. For me, it's just a matter of looking at the circular transition, right? The circular idea that we have to also involve in the way that we mine our resources. I was just talking to Jan Jongert of Superuse, which is a architecture company in Rotterdam, and they look at materials from existing buildings to implement in new buildings and reusing old buildings into new usage, instead of just thinking about, like, the one minister that we had who's responsible for living says we need to build 1 million new homes, which is not true. If we just will look differently at how we live and how we can live together and how we will reuse all buildings that are just standing empty right now. And I think it sounds similar to farmers, right? You have to then talk to the people who own the buildings, and they have an idea of usage now, and they have to transfer to a different usage, which probably will affect the way that look at the economic value of the building and also the amount of money they will get from it on the long term, right? So it's not a matter of looking at from a shareholder value, right? So how much money will I make in the future from this building? No, it's looking at how can we solve this community issue? How can we solve this government or you know, people issue? How we live together. And I think it's all in all these levels. It's similar, and I think it comes back into your book. It's very similar. It looks on these 5 huge topics, which feel like they are larger than one person can handle, but it influences also your life on all these levels, right? Like Jan was talking about, if we could rethink about how we look at cities and how we live, there's so much difference going on. Like you just mentioned, if we built more parks, we will be healthier. But it's the same with, if we reduce the number of buildings, reduce the number of cars, if we don't build new communities outside the city, and we have because then we get more cars, we get longer transportation roads. We could reduce all that, but just change the way you think about reusing stuff and think about the economic value of the current products, resources that already are there, right? Already are available. I'm just going on this. I'm sorry.
No, I think this is my, sometimes I do this thought experiment where I just think, if overnight you woke up and the entire fossil fuel infrastructure disappeared, you know, if it was all gone, well, there's no way we would build it back the same way today. Absolutely no way. We'd all be decided. We'd all be like, yeah, no, we're not, that doesn't make any sense. You know, if you sat back and you're like, okay, you've got a week to sort of come up with how you want this world to look, you wouldn't do it in that way. The only reason why it looks that way is because what we did in the past. And so it comes back to this transition thing again. And just to come back to the book, on the book, you know, doing this pessimistic and hopeful perspectives, it's not like the most extreme pessimism and the most extreme hope. It's actually both within the bounds of possibility. And I think overall, in terms of the pessimism, and this is, I am honest about how troubling this future is. So I am very upset, if you like, about that. And I think we have to be honest, because I think people respect honesty over everything, even if it makes them turn off. But we don't want them to turn off. So what the important thing to do is to be honest, to be alarming, you know, because it is really alarming. Anybody who's not alarmed by this really needs to have a look around the world right now. But then say, well, here is what it looks like if we address these things, which we know we need to do anything anyway for inflation, for your life, for the food system, because we know the food system is coming under pressure and our food prices are going to be going up. The real things that people experience, not 1.5 or 2 or these sorts of things, but what's the actual things people experience? You know, prices going up and these sorts of things. They give the solutions. And then by doing that, say, okay, so what would we like to do here? And by acting, then you build the hope for the future. So then you continue to have that dialogue where you get that punch in the gut, because that punch in the gut, I think, is very powerful, as you said earlier, in terms of thinking about, well, what can I accept in changes in my life? So some changes are super easy and we should be doing it anyway, and they can be really enjoyable. Like when I switched to vegetarianism and then moved even further towards more and more plant-based in my diet and totally plant-based, it was a slow process, you know, but it was an enjoyable process. You know, it would 5 years or so, and then suddenly I'm not really hankering for anything meat-based or animal-based anymore. So it's this slow process, and again, no judgment. It's this journey that we all make sort of internally, but you need that punch in the gut, that feeling of, oh God, and as we sort of started the conversation about flying, for example. And for these people whose lives have to change or their cultures have to change, or this is the sort of urgency that's needed in order to say, we can find better ways of making these decisions, but we do have to make these decisions. They're not going to go away. You know, you can't just sort of like play for time here because we have none. So I think that's why the book has that sort of arc, because I think it just, you know, it's that thing bubbling away, I think, that I had going on, you know, in engaging with this as a scientist, that I hope is useful for other people too.
Is there scientific has there been research done on what is more effective, negative news or positive news for an action?
Great question. Yeah, it's been quite mixed. It's, as you can imagine, it's very difficult work to do. And I'm not a social scientist, so maybe I'm not best placed to comment. I did do a lot of reading for the book in order to make sure that my messaging was useful, because I can say lots of factual things, but how do I then say that? You know, and what's the most useful way of saying that for people to engage with? And when I did the reading, it seemed like there was no real conclusion about whether messages of hope or messages of despair are best. The literature has moved on a little bit now. And I think the literature, thankfully, has sort of said the combination is usually the best. So I don't know whether this is like a selection bias of mine. Maybe there are other papers saying out there that my book wasn't the best way to do it, but at least the papers that I saw said, you know, you need a bit of both, you know, and you need to, because you can't just do the hope either, because if you just do the hope, people put their feet up on the table and they don't do anything.
Yeah.
They need that. It comes back to that wolf at the door, that real feet, that sort of like endocrine, that sort of hormonal change that you get and that you pass through and you move through and you develop through. And that's one thing I would really want to mention as well, is that many people, I don't know if people listen to this will be feeling some of these things about eco-anxiety, about despair, or even the reverse. They don't feel like anything at all. I think an important thing to remember here is that we're dynamic. We move through these things over time. So even if you think that you're in the most pit of despair, you know, that it real, like there's no hope for this, that emotion can change as well. You know, there's a great quote, when I've forgotten, George Eliot, I think it was, and she said that you know, despair is just a response to unfulfilled hope, seeing people act around you. And if you see people act around you, then you get that hope. Or if you act yourself, then you get that hope. You know, so it's really dynamic. And maybe I'm getting off topic here as a scientist who works on these things, but I think these emotions are important to engage with, and they certainly affected the way that I wrote the book as well. That the scientists can often keep all of this information and all of these emotions away from us, so we can basically write in these very sort of detached ways that don't actually say what it means. And when you actually engage with that and you decide, okay, I'm going to engage with this, then it has just has a huge impact on the way that you think and feel. And you're not pushing it away anymore. And I think scientists in general really struggle with actually accepting the emotions.
Good point. I have an interesting thought here. So two things that I'm I've written down as a topic that I want to get your opinion or insights about. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, have a deadline of 2030. What is your feeling about the SDGs in general? Is it a good idea? Is it what? How do you feel about it?
I have to say, I'm generally quite negative on a lot of the international buzzwords and as Greta Thunberg would put it, the blah, blah, blah. I don't think the SDGs are blah, blah, blah. I think there's issues in the implementation and the sketching of them out. So they were basically devised as, the next goals after the Millennium Development Goals, pretty much without consultation with sort of, say, scientists or the site. It was way more about how do we sort of organize all of these different targets. And then you've got 170, is it, or 190 different targets spread across all these SDGs. And they're supposed to be an organizing thing. But then the problem is that that's a huge number to keep abreast of, to keep an eye on. A lot of the data is very poor. And you can't get the data on a lot of these things. And then it becomes a sort of soothing words, a sort of, oh, we're doing SDG 7, we're doing SDG. How do we map what we're doing to our SDGs? And then it's just a categorization approach. Unless you're doing the 5 main sort of implementations that I mentioned earlier, unless you're finding ways to make an impact in those areas, I don't see the real benefit. Unless you've got some incentives and you're actually sort of working directly on 1 or 2, then I think, I get a bit pessimistic about it. And it's the same for a lot of these sort of big buzzwords and things, like even to some extent circular economy. I think circular economy is absolutely vital in the long term, but some of the ways in which some of these big ideas and thought things are going is a way to avoid doing the things that actually really make a difference, really actually make an impact. So I'll give you an example. I was giving a talk the other day to Google like a couple of years ago, and not the other day, a couple of years ago, and they said we've got all these amazing widgets. We've got this donut economics model for this country. We've got this model for this one. We've got this one for this one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which one do you think is the most interesting from your perspective as a scientist, Paul? And I said, look, it's all really great. It's really, really exciting to do. But fundamentally, look where your actual impacts are. Your impacts are in the information space. And there was a paper that came out 2 years ago that said that the majority of the top 100 videos on climate change were climate denial videos. That the top 50 was 52 were viewed more than the others, way more than the others, millions and millions and millions of views. That's where you have your impact. Yes, all these gadgets and widgets, they sound really nice, but where is your actual focus? And where are the areas where are you willing to take a 5-10% hit on? Or a way to transition so you don't lose that 5 to 10% hit on the advertising revenue or something, but do it, results in a much better world. This is coming up against your bottom line. So what's the hit you want to make? And where's the steps you want to go? There was a media company, an analyst media company that was talking to me in the same way. And the reason I bring this up is this SDG thing, talking about SDGs, talking about their scope 3 emissions, talking about the scope 3 emissions are the supply chain emissions. And I said, great, you're doing that. That's the absolute minimum, though. You're a services company. You're not building steel. You're not building bridges. You've got computers and paper. And the scope 3 emissions in the supply chain are very, very low. So you're doing what's easy for you to do. And then you're saying that you're mapping to SDGs and these sorts of things. Have you actually asked yourself the question, are we willing to stop working with highly carbon polluting industries? Are you willing to turn down the revenue on that? Because that's once you've had the punch in the gut, maybe internally you will get the civil sort of, not to use too violent a term, but the civil war within the company saying, well, what's this company actually going to do? So this is a long way around saying that I don't like the way in which these words are then taken and greenwashed, and these goals and targets are then taken to, and if you were to do a percentage sort of analysis of how they're used, my anecdotal evidence and so not that strong, of course, but is that they're used way more in terms of this appeasement in terms of this idea that we're doing this, we're actually sort of something, we're doing something constructive here when you're actually not.
Okay, that's not a helpful situation.
Well, no, so okay, so I mean,
No,
so
no, hold on.
yeah,
I was talking to the Loes Gast. She is an SDG voice, so she's one of the young people who talks about governments and organizations and company and educates, tells them more about the SDGs. And the thing she says was, and I agree with her, is that what the way it helps is that it's like labeling, like you just mentioned, right? You can put a label on something, and how this helps is that we have several companies who put a label of SDG 6, whatever, SDG 3 on what they are doing with this product or with this service or with a company, so that you have a language that you can talk about with other companies who do the similar thing. So you have more people can talk about the same thing. We are doing this and this and this. How are you doing this and this and this? And I think that's an advantage of the SDGs, that you have like more like a common language, which is not always right, but it gives you a direction. And I agree with you that, you know, the 5 topics you mentioned earlier, but also even just the 5 topics you mentioned in your book is these are easy too, but there's so many noises out there, and we have to find a common ground that everybody understands. How do you feel about that?
yeah, I think it's powerful to have a shared language. If you look at sort of GDP, for example, as I talk about in the book, it's a shared language in Rutger Hoekstra, who's written a fantastic book, Beyond GDP by 2030. And that shared language, it matters. It is important. Whether on balance it comes with more good than bad, I don't know. I don't know. But I remain, I mean, if you were to list out all SDGs, I mean, aside from no poverty in SDG 1, it gets harder and harder. Memory wise, I don't know how useful it is as a language when you can't, when it's difficult to remember all of them. And then within them, there's 192 odd.
Yeah, I agree. That's difficult, but still, if me personally, I would think, and a similar thing is in your book, right? It's about economics, for example, and population and progress, for example. You talk about how education, we grow as a population and we suffer the consequences, right? So we use all this oil and everything. But it looks like the growth of the population of the world is going to be decreasing after 2050 or so. And a lot has to do like the education of women, right? That's a huge lever that we can work on. Education of women is part of the SDG. So if I look at how I can help as a person, me, Erno, I do a lot of looking at young female. How can I support them as a white male plus 50, right? I think this is a topic that I can work on. Another topic I can work on is on ecological and social inequality. The rest of the SDGs are not, you know, they are important, but not important to me because I can't focus on all of them. So I pick these 3 and see how I can use this in conversations like with you, but other people as well. And how I can use this in my podcast, how I can use this in my articles, how I can use this in reading books, how I can use this on actually helping women, young women, to make a change, to help them to step up and give them a platform to talk about their ideas. And I think that's what I can do right now. There's probably more I can do, but this is, feel like you just mentioned with Google, right? What is it that you can impact?
And that's great.
And what is it? What is it that will, you know, impact your revenue? Probably not in the right way, but we don't need more money. We've got plenty, so that's not the issue, right?
Yeah. Well, it's great. It works, and you know, I'm quite willing to be persuaded otherwise. And with everything in
that was the last thing I tried to do.
Yeah.
I didn't want to try.
No,
I didn't try to persuade you.
Yeah. No. Well, I'm very persuadable, as with the book, Pessimism and Hope. It depends on the day. I just yeah. So that I mean, that's if it's a shared vision, then that's great. I mean, but I think a lot of those trends were already happening before
Hmm.
the SDGs, for example. And they've continued on to today, and so these sort of the cultural influences, but whatever's useful in terms of structuring those discussions, I think is really important. So I guess there's a question of whether would the SDGs have been better if they'd been shorter? Would they have been better if they were more in agreement with one another, that some of them weren't mutually exclusive, because some of the ones about in the economic development area and there's questions about how they were devised, and then there's questions about having a framework at all. And so but if you can find use out of them, obviously, then that's useful, then that's a good outcome. On the population thing, of course, it's just how we're consuming, which is the biggest impact. And population really is just absolutely the sort of the wrong question going forwards in terms of sustainability. And just a really interesting number the other day that I saw, that China posted a total fertility rate of 1.1. So you need 2.1 children per woman to stay stable, the population to stay stable. And that 0.1 is for people who don't get to childbearing age, etc. And they posted 1.15. I mean, that is a crazy reduction. China will reduce about 700 million people by the end of this century. The EU, for example, by the middle of this century, will be losing more people than Germany took in the maximum influx in Syrian refugees. We're going to be having so much more migration due to climate change that we really should start sort of these discussions around what does that look like going into the future when we have this demographic bust in many countries and migration. So perhaps a totally different discussion there. But,
No, I agree, because I think I was talking to another entrepreneur on this topic, and he mentioned a great insight from me there. He said we either got to solve it on our own soil here in the Netherlands, right, and intake refugees, because we have caused a situation over there, right? We've caused a drought and all the influences by nature that caused by the fossil fuels, or we solve the issue over there, right? We make sure that they have a livable environment, however we can, right? So, for example, as a farmer, I just read about this morning. As a farmer, we can look at it. I need more farming. I need more cows. I need a bigger farm, because otherwise I can't sustain. Or I could look at it and part of it has to do with the Netherlands is number 2 of exporting of meat and dairy, next to the US, which is quite a bit larger than the Netherlands. We have to not just export the food, because that just ruins people's income in other parts in the world, right? We could also export our knowledge as a farmer and help the farmers over there to build a better farm and a better ecological, agricultural and everything over there. Because one of the reasons they say if you want to decrease our farms, you have to think about the meat that they will produce, and with more negative impact, because they are not farming as well as we are. That's one of the reasons that they are throwing at us as why they have to still be huge. Export your knowledge, help them to become better, and to have like an environment where everybody can live, or take in these refugees in the Netherlands, because Netherlands, Europe, in the Western world, because we have caused the problems that they are facing right now. So I thought it was a great point, and I agree with it. I have one more thing. The IDGs. Have you heard about the IDGs, Inner Development Goals?
Oh, I haven't looked into it deeply, but yeah, I've heard of it.
Because you just mentioned about you think that like you did as a scientist, you should also look more like an emotional aspect, right? The IDGs are connected to the SDGs. Probably, maybe that's it's like a minor fault of the IDGs as I see it right now. But the IDGs, and it's also, they have 21 in a development goals, but there's not like hundreds below them, but it's 21, which is not, it's not little, it's not, but it's still 21. It's doable, and they're separated in 5 domains. So it's, I think you can remember it in the end if you practice often enough. But the idea is that as a person, you want to grow internally. You want to grow as with your knowledge, with your courage, making better decision, with your inner compass. Which direction are we going? For example, those are a couple of those goals that are mentioned in there. And the idea is, if you do that, if you work on your internal and yourself, we can work together on all these bigger transformations or issues or crises, however you want to call this. I think, no. Explaining this to you, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so that's the first detail that I've seen on it. I've seen things come up on feeds and things in attention. I mean, it sounds great. I think I haven't looked into the different goals, so I can't really sort of comment, but in any depth. But the idea that we would focus on what we want is in terms of well-being, in terms of physiological, natural well-being, mental well-being is really, it's really important. We've come a long way from that in the current systems that we sort of operate in, and day to day we struggle to assert what these goals are in our own lives. We know that they're important. So I guess the question again then becomes, to what extent will these be a helpful structure compared to, say, other sort of cognitive behavioral therapies, or compared to other sort of self-help structures? I would have to look into them a little bit more, but anything that allows you to get some distance from that. I think we do have this, we have to look within and without. So yeah, why are we even focusing on these inner development goals? Probably because we're stuck in systems that really we all struggle in to find ourselves. So if the inner development goals can help us put pressure on that system in the different areas of levers, the different leverages that we can push in society, then it can only be a good thing if it can help us identify those areas and for levers that we can change.
Right. The way that we mentioned it was personal transformation for external change.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I hadn't seen that, but yeah, that's exactly what I could imagine being very, very useful. And that thing of being overwhelmed, just maybe to reflect on that a little bit more, that thing of being overwhelmed by your ability to control or your ability to be in a society and different systems. Something that I find quite helpful is this idea that of fractals, where these pictures where you zoom out and it all kind of looks the same. And you see in society, we're sort of trapped in the societies that we have, because at larger scales, we've made some decisions. And then at even larger scales, we've made those decisions. So we drive cars because we've built those roads. Those roads were built because of the local planning arrangements, which at the national level was an infrastructure plan. And so it's turtles all the way down, right? So, and that can feel a little bit overwhelming. But when we think about the systems transition, so that's the system, it all looks the same from the different things. We have to change that system. How do we get the feedbacks from all those different behaviors that we can have all the way up through the system? And I think, really good examples like plant-based diets, for example, are very important. We do have individual agency. It's true that the entire system has to change, but the entire system can change even faster if we have that individual agency, and vice versa. So if I eat more plant-based diets, the market reacts. It offers more plant-based options. Farmers have more chance to grow vegetables or fruits over dairy, etc. And so it's sort of right down to that individual level of the IDGs up to that level of the SDGs. And it just sort of helps me to think about those things. And then you can get into the policy, the really complex technical policy discussions of like, okay, we see more people are interested in this now. Now that there are more vegetarian options on the menu, research suggests that we have more meat eaters eating those options. So that we're seeing even more sort of explosion. How do we then facilitate a shift in, say, where things are arranged in stores, in shops? so that people can have easy access to those foods. It's in front of their faces. It's not just like the junk food at the end of the aisle or whatever. The small little steps that could have huge leverage points for the change, and then accelerating the change at different levels, and then, where do we place the supermarkets, so that they're within walking distance. Netherlands doesn't really have that problem. They're everywhere, but, other countries do. So, how do we then have these different sort of impact points at different areas of the system? Yeah. And it can feel very overwhelming, but I think that inner development goal idea is a really nice way of having that personal impact on the world already.
Yeah.
Agency.
Paul, I feel like we could talk like much longer. There's so much more. I've already learned so much from you by reading the book, by now talking to you, reading your posts on LinkedIn. So for me, it was a delight and very insightful to have this conversation with you. Thank you for that. If you as a listener, want to do something right now and want to learn about the 5 points that you already mentioned, but also, get the pessimistic and hopeful view of the 5 large issues that we are facing now. And I just should mention them: population, energy, food, climate, and economics. Just go and read the book. It's not huge. A large part of the book is just all references, which is helpful, because then you could even go deeper into the various topics that we mentioned. I think it's very well written, easy to understand. It's not a very difficult scientific book that you're reading. So I highly recommend the book and to learn more about this. So thank you, Paul, for doing this for us.
Thanks so much, Erno. It was such a lovely discussion this morning, and thanks. So, with the references, they're all very easy to read scientific papers as well. So I try to sort of choose the ones that are sort of really nice reads on their own as well. So you can go into them and sort of read a little bit more. But thanks so much for the discussion, Erno.
Thank you.